So here we are then. So far, so good. We've considered and picked the variables that we're going to use in the manufacture of our ammunition. We've adopted a comprehensive approach, and we've decided how many rounds we're going to shoot in each group. Now it's time to get shooting. The Mark III Snider-Enfield, working up at 100 yards, Part 2. In this video, we'll outline the following: shooting the groups, deciding on your load, the use of the sights and adjustment of the sights or sight picture. Shooting the groups. This is the meat and potatoes of any workup for any rifle. It takes the most time, the most concentration, and the most patience. On any given day I'm working up a rifle, I'd expect to shoot 50 or 60 rounds, sometimes less and sometimes more. As we remember from part 1 of this series, a comprehensive approach could take some time indeed, many hundreds of rounds being fired, all in the name of finding that best load. Although there were many more types of loadings shot as part of the workup of my Mark III Snider. Here I've used 7 examples to demonstrate the process.
The first load we'll try is 57.5 grains of 3F with cornmeal filler.
Now each grouping consisted of 10 rounds, although I haven't shown all 10 here.
Now 60 grains of 3F.
As with most black powder firearms, some sort of regular cleaning regime is usually beneficial to maintaining best consistency. The Snider is no exception, and I typically give the bore a wipe after every 10-round group.
Well, there's the results from 57.5 grains and 60 of 3F behind the 600 X-ring services bullet with cornmeal filler to take up the difference in the space inside the casing.
Each grouping has its own set of data recorded. Now this process takes a bit of extra time, both at the range as well as when you're home. But the peace of mind that you get after crunching these numbers is definitely worth it. More about this process later on in the video.
The last group we'll shoot today is 62.5 grains of 3F. Well, now that's quite a bit better, isn't it?
2 more groupings, shot with 60 and 62.5 grains of 3F.
Again, 60 grains of 3F, 62.5.
And of course the obligatory collection of data. Of course this process demands that you shoot quite a bit. Multiple outings with many rounds shot in each one. But the results are worth it. Take your time and don't try and do it all in one outing. Here are 2 more groups.
The one on the left here is shot with 75 grains of 2F. The one on the right, 62.5 of 3F.
So we've done our shooting, and we've recorded our data. But before I carry on, perhaps this small vignette might help explain why I use the figure of merit to gauge consistency.
Now the group size between these 2 groups is not that much different. Only about 2 inches bigger here if we take the total spread of the rounds that are farthest away from each other. However, the grouping on the right is much more consistent. That is to say that the rounds are generally closer together. And this is shown when we calculate the figure of merit. This one here will have a smaller figure of merit than, of course, the one on the left.
I hope that was beneficial in understanding why the figure of merit is perhaps a better gauge of consistency than simply group size. At the end of the day, what you have is a big stack of paper with a bunch of numbers on it. Now, how to turn those numbers into something meaningful, that's what we'll talk about next. The method of calculating the figure of merit and the benefits of using this measure have been explained in an earlier video. I would strongly suggest that if you're interested, that you watch this before carrying on with the rest of this video. The data that I collect when shooting gets inputted into this simple spreadsheet. 1 sheet per group. Once each group has been inputted and calculated, the figure of merit and the group size are noted for the input into the master log. It is this sheet that truly shows which load is most consistent. It takes all the inputted numerical data and turns it into a graph. But it also has one more key feature, and that is when shooting multiple groups of the same load, it will average your results, further refining the picture. Let's take a look. Here we see a list of numerous groups shot with their figure of merit and group size. They've been arranged so that the best figure of merit is on top. Note also that particular loads have been shot multiple times, each with their own entry. Each loading combination has been represented as a line in the corresponding graph. Here we can see that the graph represents the average for each loading. Once everything's been inputted, it's simply a matter of reading the graph and finding your load. In this case, 62.5 grains of 3F, with the best average figure of merit being 1.89 inches. Now that we have the rifle shooting at its most consistent, it's time to place those consistent rounds on the right spot and target. Zeroing the rifle. Before we go further, a quick explanation on the use of the sights. Historically, there were 3 different sight pictures used in Victorian times to enable the man to pick intermediate range settings between the 100-yard increments that the sights were typically graduated in. They were the fine sight, with the tip of the foresight barleycorn at the very bottom of the back sight notch, the half sight, with the barleycorn placed halfway up the notch, and the full sight, with the tip of the front sight placed in line with the top edge of the back sight. For me, the latter is the easiest to adopt, and it's this sight picture that I use for my zeroing applications. Although point of aim is as much a personal choice as anything else, I typically use a 6 o'clock hold. Whether I'm shooting at an orange steel plate or at a bullseye target, placing the top of the front sight at the bottom of the aiming mark is the method I use. Combined with this sight picture is an intended main point of impact about 2 inches above. That way, the rounds should hit the actual object I'm aiming at. So now, your rifle groups tighter than a drum. It's just a question of moving your MPI. This is done one of 2 ways, either modifying the sights or modifying the sight picture. Now, these antique rifles can be somewhat expensive, and people acquire them for various reasons. Some of those reasons may preclude someone from actually modifying the sights, for fear of a loss in value or simply appearance-wise not being completely historical. But not doing so will limit your ability to produce accurate fire. Now this is understandable, so we're left with basically 3 choices. Shooting with original and untouched sights, also known as aiming off, modifying the existing sights by adding metal or changing their shape, or the possible addition of some modification in a semi-permanent or temporary guise. Whatever method you choose, chances are you're going to have to accommodate quite a significant difference from the point of aim to the MPI.
While I'm here, this is a good time to show that, for the most part, Victorian service rifles shoot a great deal high. Considering the point of aim is right here, and the rounds are, well, as you can see them.
The most basic method used to adjust your MPI is simply aiming off. In this example, a 5-round group is shot using a full sight at a 6 o'clock hold. The 5 rounds, although quite consistent and close together, have hit the target high and to the right. Given the group's distance from the center of the target, the appropriate correction to the sight picture would be to place it at the bottom left of the target, its distance and direction from the initial point of aim corresponding to the distance and direction that the MPI is from the intended MPI, in this case the center of the target. Doing so will have the desired effect in bringing the MPI and the intended MPI together. Now this is a rather extreme example, and it all depends on how far off you're shooting. Here's a more subtle example. In taking a 6 o'clock hold with a full sight, we find the rounds are slightly right and just slightly low. An appropriate correction might be to shift the point of aim to the outside of the black at the 7 o'clock position. This will have the effect of shifting the MPI up and to the left, matching it to the intended MPI, which again is the center of the target. Personally, rather than aiming off, I prefer to physically adjust my sights. I use semi-permanent modifications to the sights of these rifles, but as alluded to before, there are alternatives as to how this is done. Perhaps the best resource for ideas in how to modify your Snider sights are found in the British military forum Snider-Enfield forum. In a thread entitled Snider Alternate Sighting Systems, you'll find all kinds of examples on how to do this. Some are permanent, some semi-permanent, and some completely temporary. I'll include the link in the description below. So, before you go soldering or cutting or filing, it's important to understand just how far you have to move your sights. For this, I use a feature included in the figure of merit calculator. Included in the lower left is a sight adjustment tool that is based on the sight radius and the range to the target. If we examine the grouping diagram found at the lower right, we see markings on the graph for the point of aim, the MPI, and the intended MPI. The sight adjustment tool will tell you the modifications you need to make to your sights in order to have your MPI match as closely as possible to your intended MPI. You can see here in brown the adjustments that you need to make to either or both sights. The corrections are given in thousandths of an inch. Typically, service rifles of the Victorian era will shoot to the point of aim at 200 yards. This trajectory diagram shows how things line up. The purple line represents the direction the barrel is pointed in. The red line represents the trajectory of the bullet, which starts dropping as soon as it leaves the muzzle. The light blue line represents the line of sight through the sights, corresponding to the point at which the bullet hits the target. When shooting at closer range, say 100 yards, this changes. When the target is closer, the bullet strikes higher. This is evidenced in the clip shown earlier. Adding material to the top of the front sight, in this case a small piece of brass stock, raises the point of aim, represented here by the dark blue line, thus making it correspond to the point at which the bullet strikes the target at the closer range of 100 yards. So, with the trajectory and the line of sight mated up, the point of aim and the MPI match, with the result being that you're hitting what you're aiming at. That's how to fix elevation problems, which are typically on the high side. Now, this was all understood in Victorian times, and this page from the Musketry Manual of 1859 has a very similar diagram to that which I just used. Now, what to do about windage? The figure of merit calculator does indeed tell you which way, left or right, to move your sights to accommodate windage issues. But it's important to understand the theory behind it. Here we see a conventional sight picture placed for a bullseye hold, that is to say, at the center of the target. When we shoot our group, we find that it's hitting to the right. Now there are two ways we can go about changing this sight picture. One is moving the front sight, and the second is moving the back sight. For windage issues, I typically move the back sight. Now, the back sight must be moved in an opposite direction to that which the MPI is in relation to the point of aim. If the MPI is to the right, move the back sight left, and so on. Now the exact measurement that the back sight moves is found on the figure of merit calculator, but suffice it to say, the back sight moves enough to bring the MPI on to the POA. Now, we'll talk about the way I modify my sights in a semi-permanent way to achieve these results. First, I'll show you the method I use to change the front sight. Simply put, I solder a thin piece of brass stock to the top of the front sight. I ensure that it stands proud so that I can file it down for fine-tuning. Here is a rather tall example as used on my Mark II Snider short rifle. The modification made to the Mark III long rifle is not quite so tall. Part of the reasoning behind this is that I still wish to have the bayonet able to fit over the front sight. If it was too tall, the ring would not clear it. This results in an MPI that is slightly high, but I can live with that. For windage, that is to say left and right adjustments, I typically modify the back sight. I do this by soldering a small piece of brass stock to the back edge of the back sight cap. Once this has been fixed, I then file a small notch, correspondingly left or right, as per the measurement given in the figure of merit calculator. By placing the front side in that notch, we correspondingly shift our MPI. You can see the piece of brass stock here. This also has the added benefit of making a notch that's much smaller than the service sights provide. This allows for a tighter, crisper, and finer sight picture. The better for shooting. In this example, that on my P53, you can see a perhaps more extreme example of the adjustment of windage. The new notch is shifted considerably to the right, and this view shows the difference in size between the service notch and the new one. The most important aspect of these modifications is that they are semi-permanent. The service sights have not been altered in any meaningful way. If anything, the sights are missing just a tiny bit of bluing. To bring them back to service standards would require just a little bit of work and touch-up. So there you have it, from beginning to end. Some principles and concepts, some variables, and suggestions on some loads you might want to try. Combine this with your own skills in marksmanship and hopefully a spot of decent weather, and you'll be set up for success. At the end of it all, you'll know that the load you've selected and trialed is the absolute best for your Snider. And not only is the load the best, but you'll either know how to aim off properly, or you've adjusted your sights so that you'll hit what you aim at. See, look what a little bit of work results in. That steel plate never had a chance. And don't forget Martin at X-Ring Services. Whether you want to try the 530 grain Snider bullet or the 440 grain Bumblebee, he has them both in stock. Combine either of these with his affordable Snider brass and you'll have a winning combination.